Istanbul. Population 15 million. A city in perpetual motion. Istanbul is the vanguard of Turkey. Even though the city is turned resolutely towards the future, it can't shake off its past, its history, and its legends. Byzantium. Constantinople. The only capital in the world that straddles two continents. For travelers, it will forever be the gateway to the Orient. It doesn't matter that a number of bridges, and in the near future a tunnel, allow hundreds of thousands of commuters to go back and forth from Europe to Asia every day. The Bosphorus continues to symbolize the boundary and the link between the two continents.
On a beaucoup parlé, disons, de l'axe est-ouest.
People always talk about the east-west axis, Orient-Occident, with Istanbul as a sort of bridge, a link between these two geographical entities. But you mustn't forget the north-south axis as well, because the Bosphorus is, in fact, a strait that, via the little Marmara Sea, links the Black Sea with the Mediterranean.
The many Byzantine and Ottoman citadels that dot the opposite shores of the Bosphorus show the strategic importance of this strait.
Istanbul has several names. During the Ottoman Empire in particular, it was called the Sublime Gateway, the seat of the Caliphate. They used to call it Der Saadet, the door to happiness, and the Slavs, the Russians in particular, called it Charigrad, meaning the city of the Chari, the city of the sultans. So they also had a kind of fascination for the city of Istanbul.
Ever since Catherine II launched her expansionist policy towards the south, all the Tsars have been obsessed by the idea of obtaining access to warm water ports for Russia. Once they had managed to reach the shores of the Black Sea, Istanbul was the only remaining obstacle between Russia and the Mediterranean.
However, this geographical proximity naturally gave rise to a lot of connections as well. It wasn't all conflict. There were cultural exchanges also. There were people traveling back and forth, that is, until the Soviet Union came into being. Then came the Iron Curtain, as it was called at the time. But since the collapse of the USSR, the exchanges have started up again, first with the Turcophone republics of the ex-Soviet Union near Central Asia, and now with Ukraine and Russia as well.
We leave Istanbul and the Bosphorus behind and head north for the Ukraine. Ever since ancient times, the Black Sea, sheltered by its straits, has been shrouded in mystery. The Greeks, who established colonies on its shores, called it the Pont Euxine, meaning the Friendly Bay. Its name changed with the Turks, who at the time designated each of the four cardinal points with a different color: black for the north, white for the south. So this sea, situated to the north of their empire, became the Black Sea, and the Mediterranean, the White Sea. After a day of sailing along the coast of Bulgaria and Romania, we enter the delta of the Danube, home to one of Europe's largest natural reserves. Danube, like the Bosphorus, played an important role in the relations between Orient and Occident. Since it empties into the Black Sea, it's an ideal gateway to penetrate into the heart of Europe. The hordes of Vandals, Visigoths, and Huns from Asia all swept up the river to invade the Occident. In the morning, our boat, the Taras Shevchenko, comes into Odessa, the Ukraine's largest port. Odessa. This is not your ordinary port. All you have to do is close your eyes and uploom images of the Russian Revolution of 1905, of the mutiny on the battleship Potemkin. Odessa. 6 red letters forever linked with Sergei Eisenstein's film masterpiece.
Yes, it's true that there was an uprising of the sailors on the battleship. But the events portrayed in the film were for the most part the fruit of Eisenstein's inspiration. The fact is, the episode didn't arouse the popular fervor and admiration that, for ideological reasons, the government needed. Eisenstein, in a truly masterly fashion, invented all the events on the large stairway from A to Z. When they were filming here in Odessa, the scenes on the top of the Potemkin stairway and on the Primovsky Boulevard, they had a crowd of extras. They were talking about the filming. There were soldiers marching, and then there was the famous baby carriage with the baby inside. And who could have imagined that that baby would become a renowned scientist, a PhD in science and mathematics, Professor Glauberman, who went on to become the head of the physics department at the University of Odessa.
Even with its overtones of Soviet propaganda, Eisenstein's film remains a masterpiece. The scene with the baby carriage has surely done more to make the city famous than all its tourist flyers. The inhabitants of Odessa are very proud of their famous stairway. It's a historical monument for them, but also a place to go for a stroll.
This stairway was constructed more than 200 years ago. The city of Odessa began to develop around this stairway.
The Potemkin stairway is the symbol of Odessa, and that's why it's important, as important for the tourists as for the residents.
The statue at the top of the stairway is not Potemkin, general that captured the city from the Turks in 1789. It's a statue of the Duc de Richelieu, a Frenchman who fled the French Revolution and became the first governor of the city in 1803.
One could say that the Duc de Richelieu is the spiritual father of Odessa. It was he who conceived of the basic idea of the city, a city of immigrants who were drawn here by the freedom of commerce that existed in this open port.
Catherine II wanted to make Odessa a sort of St. Petersburg of the South, a prestigious city on the Black Sea. Little by little, thanks to European and especially Italian architects, the city developed in size and beauty. But what outweighed aesthetic concerns was Catherine II's desire to bolster her power before the Ottoman Empire.
There was this idea that Odessa was at the center of a buffer zone between the Russian and Ottoman empires. That's why the Russian government wanted to attract immigrants that were opposed to Turkey. First, there were the Greeks, Bulgarians, and Serbs, followed by all the inhabitants of the Balkans under Turkish domination. There was a time when even the Russians who came to Odessa had the status of temporary immigrants. They could come and take their chances on an equal footing with the foreigners.
From this melting pot of adventurers and wildcat entrepreneurs was born a unique city with a singular charm. Even today, 2 centuries after it was founded, Odessa is still a cosmopolitan city very active in trade. It's obvious when you take a walk through the Central Market, considered the largest food market in Eastern Europe.
Яку надо? Жирненькую. Средненькую. Ну, это вот за неделю. Средненькая такая. Это прошлого года,
Throughout the 19th century, the city continued to grow in size and beauty, thanks to the thriving activity of the port and the grain exported from the Ukraine, Russia's breadbasket. At the same time, Odessa attracted writers, painters, and musicians. At the end of the 19th century, every self-respecting city had to have an opera house. Even Manaus, lost in the middle of the Amazon jungle, had one. Odessa's opera house was inaugurated in 1880. In the summer, when they're not out enjoying the sun on the beaches of the Black Sea, the inhabitants of Odessa can be found in the city's tree-shaded parks. We sailed into Odessa with the dramatic scenes of Eisenstein's Potemkin. We now leave it on the gold and purple notes of the opera house and the light airs of Verdi. As we leave Odessa, we set our course east in the direction of Crimea and Yalta, our next port of call. The weather is perfect. No wind. A sea of glass. We notice, however, that the boat never strays too far from the coast.
These boats were designed for mixed navigation, sea and river. They have a limited range on the sea. On the other hand, thanks to their shallow draft, they can navigate on all the rivers. The Dnieper, the Danube, and the Volga as well. On the seas, we have to stay within 10 miles of the coast, 50 miles in the port zones.
We're coming into Yalta, nestled at the foot of lush green mountains, and with its airs of a bourgeois seaside resort of the late 19th century. Something like Biarritz or Brighton, with the golden domes of the Alexander Nevsky Cathedral added on. Yalta is the most popular seaside resort in Crimea. In summer, its population doubles. In a way, it was the Tsar Nicholas I who made Yalta fashionable. In 1837, he decided to accord what was then a small town the status of a full-fledged city. Then, following his example, all the Russian aristocracy flocked to spend the winter in the vicinity of Yalta. The famous Swallow's Nest is all that remains of a huge palace that collapsed into the sea due to an earthquake. A mixture of styles is quite common. The Vorontsov Palace. Its austere medieval-style facade is joined to a monumental oriental temple facing out onto gardens and the sea. Yalta was a favorite resort for many artists and writers. Chekhov came for the climate and to treat his tuberculosis. In 1898, he had a small house built where he brought his family to live. This is where he wrote his most well-known play, The Cherry Orchard, and where he entertained his friends, among whom were Tolstoy and Gorky. The imperial traditions were carried on without interruption in the years following the Bolshevik takeover, for here in Crimea, the Communist Party officials would also come to holiday in the mansions of the deposed aristocracy. It was in one of these mansions, the Livadia Palace, a residence with 120 rooms built by the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, that Stalin decided to host the Yalta Conference in February 1945.
It was an extremely important conference because they were dealing with such a vital issue, the world order after the war. Given the very weighty nature of the conference, the participants, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, the heads of state of the USSR, the USA, and Great Britain, were all quite tense. They worked hard. They held long discussions. But there were some lighter moments. Joking, smiling, and then there were the receptions and dinners hosted by each one of them. And so Roosevelt, for instance, during an unofficial meeting, mentioned to Stalin that he liked the Livadia Palace so much that he wanted to buy it when he finished his term as president. Stalin answered that it was absolutely out of the question. Crimea was not for sale, and it still had to develop.
At the close of this summer's day, the seaside esplanade comes alive with an incredible variety of sights. In spite of their innocent appearances, they all have their hidden message. This little folklore show for children with its huge Russian flag for a backdrop has strong nationalistic overtones. There are many Russians living in the Ukraine, and certain groups are pushing for Moscow to seize control of the country. A little further on, the young people can play Hell's Angels and get a photo for a modest fee. And still further on, a former serviceman is singing his nostalgia for the ex-Soviet Union, while teenagers are rollerblading. And a family on vacation deck themselves out as postcard Romanovs. To reach his dreams, to reach his nostalgia. next morning, we're coming into Sevastopol. The entire history of this city, founded in 1783, revolves around military activity. Up until 1991, the powerful Black Sea Fleet was stationed here in Sevastopol. When the Soviet Union broke up, the city became Ukrainian, but a large part of the fleet remained the property of Russia. An ambivalent situation? Well, not for the Russians, who still feel quite at home here in Sevastopol. We'll find out for ourselves what this two-headed city looks like, but for now, the Taras Shevchenko is docking to the tune of a brass band. Military, of course. Sevastopol, like almost everywhere in the ex-Soviet Union, has a good number of imposing monuments commemorating the victims of the Second World War. Their size is, in fact, a true reflection of the heavy tribute the country paid in its struggle against the Nazi invaders. So Sevastopol and the military march in step together. And as is written on this monument, Sevastopol honors the memory of the unseen soldiers. In other words, the members of the ex-KGB. While young sailors listlessly roam the streets, a very special commando group with their gold braids and form-fitting uniforms is trying to charm its meager audience. By now we've gotten the picture that the city lives exclusively from and for the military. There are countless museums, exhibits, panoramas, and vistas commemorating different feats of arms. For example, this huge circular canvas, 115 meters long, that illustrates the heroic defense of Sevastopol in 1855, when the French and English laid siege to the city during the Crimean War. Back to the port. This young lady with her megaphone is advertising Sevastopol's Star Excursion, a boat ride around the harbor to see the famous Black Sea Fleet.
Back in the days of the Soviet Union, the Sevastopol fleet was made up of 350 ships and around 50 submarines. After the breakup of the USSR, the fleet was divided between the two countries, Russia and the Ukraine.
The two countries have signed an agreement that allows the Russian fleet to stay until 2017. Russians form a large majority in Sevastopol, and our guide, who's married to a Russian officer, tries to convince us that the city does not in fact belong to the Ukrainians.
The city is not divided into Ukrainian and Russian sectors. The Ukrainians feel like aliens here. No one speaks Ukrainian. This is a very conservative town. In light of its history, more than 80% of the inhabitants want the city to be part of Russia. They can't imagine living without the Russian fleet. For them, it would be like tearing their heart out.
We continued our route on the Black Sea during the night. In the morning, we enter the delta of the Dnieper, and we slowly start heading upriver to Zaporozhye, our next port of call. The Dnipro, as the Ukrainians call it, takes its source in Russia, then crosses the vast plains of the Ukraine and empties into the Black Sea. The Varangians were a tribe of Vikings who came from the north and followed the river valley, setting up trading posts along the way. They came down the Dnieper all the way to the Black Sea and to Constantinople, which they attacked in 860. This route, which linked the Baltic Sea to the Greco-Roman Mediterranean, became known as the Varangian route. It was to play a crucial role in the history of Russia, for it was a Varangian prince who seized power in Kiev, thus founding the Kiev Russia, which ushered in the first known period of Russian history. It lasted up until the Tatar-Mongol invasion. In the morning, we arrive at Zaporozhye. An industrial city with close to 1 million inhabitants, Zaporozhye likes to think of itself as a seaside resort. The main thoroughfare that crosses the city is 10 kilometers long and rather lacking in charm. But we can see that Zaporozhye is developing, and here and there, we spot some surprisingly modern aspects. At the beginning of the 16th century, the region of Zaporozhye, protected by the many islands in the Dnieper, became the historic center of the Ukrainian Cossacks.
The Cossacks are usually described in all the textbooks as a free and armed people. Now, just what does that mean? Well, the Cossacks considered that they were free men, not bound by any laws, like Robin Hood. In spite of that, from the 15th century on, these free people gradually banded together to form an organized army. Their duty was to defend their territory and their people from the Tatar invasions and enslavement by the Poles.
For a long time under the USSR, the Cossack culture was outlawed, surely in reprisal for their participation in the counter-revolution of 1918 and the collaboration of certain Cossacks with the Nazi occupying forces during the Second World War. But now Cossack culture is undergoing a revival. This equestrian show for the benefit of tourists is one example.
Regarding the traditions, like lance handling, charges on horseback with sabers, or the numbers I do with whips, those are all military traditions. Regarding the Cossack culture that was lost during the Soviet period, we are doing our best to bring it back to life.
Zaporozhye, its name means beyond the rapids, is well known for the Dnieper Dam, the first dam built by the USSR. Its construction lasted from 1927 to 1932 and benefited from American aid. In order to continue our journey upriver, we have to pass through the gigantic lock off to one side of the dam. After slowly rising about 20 meters, we leave the lock and find ourselves on the dam's retaining lake, a veritable inland sea. We're now embarking on the last leg of our trip, which will take us further up the Dnieper to Kiev. With its all-out drive to produce, the USSR under Stalin needed energy, so they decided to build the Dnieper, the largest dam in the world at the time. The river valley was flooded for 40 kilometers upstream. Hundreds of thousands of peasants were relocated, their villages flooded. A gigantic undertaking carried out in part by prisoners of the gulags.
Here on the chart, we can follow our course and note down information concerning the navigation. Every spring, we update the chart and the navigation conditions. We take depth measurements, we make note of the hazards, the markers, the islets, the reefs, and sandbars, and any and all information that could help us choose our course and avoid hazards.
Our cruise is drawing to a close. Faithful to tradition, the captain meets with the passengers for a final drink. In the morning, we arrive at Kiev. We slowly glide by the hills, topped by the domes of the Peschersk Lavra, the Kiev Monastery of the Caves, the city's largest monastery. The buildings of the monastery blend in with the landscape, but the Steel Maiden, the nickname of the gigantic statue representing the motherland at the entrance of the city, juts up like a lighthouse. After a final maneuver, we dock in front of the passenger terminal, a shining example of the Soviet style of the 1930s. Independence Square, the heart of Kiev. This square has become the meeting place for the city's youth, as well as for tourists out sightseeing. It still resonates with the cries of joy that greeted the country's newfound independence in 1991. The history of Kiev in the Ukraine began, in fact, a long time ago. The city was founded by the Varangian prince Oleg. Under his successors, the kingdom expanded from the Black Sea to the Baltic Sea. The kingdom of Kiev drew its wealth and power from river trade with Byzantium. In 988, the marriage of King Vladimir with the daughter of the Byzantine emperor sealed relations between the two states and marked the advent of Orthodox Christianity in the Ukraine. Over the centuries, scores of churches were constructed throughout the city. The Kiev Monastery of the Caves, whose construction began in the 11th century, eventually became the intellectual center of the Kingdom of Kiev. Devastated by the Tatars and fires, turned into a museum under Stalin, this monastery is now gradually recovering some of its former splendor. Kiev has no intention of resting on the laurels of its past. The mother of all Eastern Slavs, for so long oriented towards Byzantium and then Moscow, is now looking in new directions, towards the West and Europe, and even beyond, towards the United States. We're coming to an end of our stay here in Kiev. We began our voyage in Istanbul, Byzantium of the olden days, embodied by the magnificence of the Basilica of St. Sophia. And now we finish it here in Kiev, where we discover the Cathedral of St. Sophia, Kiev's dazzling homage to Byzantium.
The Kiev Russia has always had a great admiration for the Byzantine Empire. It was from Byzantium that Christianity spread through Russia in the 10th century. The first priests came from Byzantium. The builders, architects, and painters of the first churches came from Byzantium as well. And they passed on their knowledge and skills to the local craftsmen. The basics of constructing temples, their cross-shaped layout, the paintings, and in general, all the architectural canons that developed in Russia carry the stamp of the Byzantine Empire.
Istanbul. Population 15 million. A city in perpetual motion. Istanbul is the vanguard of Turkey. Even though the city is turned resolutely towards the future, it can't shake off its past, its history, and its legends. Byzantium. Constantinople. The only capital in the world that straddles two continents. For travelers, it will forever be the gateway to the Orient. It doesn't matter that a number of bridges, and in the near future a tunnel, allow hundreds of thousands of commuters to go back and forth from Europe to Asia every day. The Bosphorus continues to symbolize the boundary and the link between the two continents.
On a beaucoup parlé, disons, de l'axe est-ouest.
People always talk about the east-west axis, Orient-Occident, with Istanbul as a sort of bridge, a link between these two geographical entities. But you mustn't forget the north-south axis as well, because the Bosphorus is, in fact, a strait that, via the little Marmara Sea, links the Black Sea with the Mediterranean.
The many Byzantine and Ottoman citadels that dot the opposite shores of the Bosphorus show the strategic importance of this strait.
Istanbul has several names. During the Ottoman Empire in particular, it was called the Sublime Gateway, the seat of the Caliphate. They used to call it Der Saadet, the door to happiness, and the Slavs, the Russians in particular, called it Charigrad, meaning the city of the Chari, the city of the sultans. So they also had a kind of fascination for the city of Istanbul.
Ever since Catherine II launched her expansionist policy towards the south, all the Tsars have been obsessed by the idea of obtaining access to warm water ports for Russia. Once they had managed to reach the shores of the Black Sea, Istanbul was the only remaining obstacle between Russia and the Mediterranean.
However, this geographical proximity naturally gave rise to a lot of connections as well.
The straits has been shrouded in mystery. The Greeks, who established colonies on its shores, called it the Pont Euxine, meaning the Friendly Bay. Its name changed with the Turks, who at the time designated each of the four cardinal points with a different color: black for the north, white for the south. So this sea, situated to the north of their empire, became the Black Sea, and the Mediterranean, the White Sea. After a day of sailing along the coast of Bulgaria and Romania, we enter the delta of the Danube, home to one of Europe's largest natural reserves.
It wasn't all conflict. There were cultural exchanges also. There were people traveling back and forth, that is, until the Soviet Union came into being. Then came the Iron Curtain, as it was called at the time. But since the collapse of the USSR, the exchanges have started up again, first with the Turcophone republics of the ex-Soviet Union near Central Asia, and now with Ukraine and Russia as well.
We leave Istanbul and the Bosphorus behind and head north for the Ukraine. Ever since ancient times, the Black Sea, sheltered by its